let me hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Yanis. Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here to be introducing digital product equity to you. I'll start with a sort of an about me. I'm a UX researcher, very interested in customer strategy as well as UX design. And so I started out in my path as a qualitative UX researcher, and then more recently I moved to become customer segment manager at Scotiabank, where I was looking at the digitally underserved customer base. And so last summer, as part of that project, I really did a deep dive on digital product equity. For me personally, as well as professionally, we were moving from, I had moved to a new team, which was enterprise accessibility and digital product equity, and we were going to build this out. So today what I want to do is I want to sort of unpack some of the challenges associated with accessibility and digital product equity. I'm going to review some of the common themes that I found and also share best practices that I discovered through this industry research. So when I first heard the term digital product equity, I looked it up and I found some definitions. Here are a few on the page. But what I want to say is you don't have to read all of this, and I'm going to sort of unpack that as my promise. But let me just go through a few of them. One says, product inclusion and equity is the ongoing work of building belonging through our products by centering the most marginalized voices at every phase of product creation. When I read that as a newbie into the world of digital product equity, I was like, wow, I don't think we're doing this right now. And how can we do it better? And then another, like Adobe says, product equity is the state in which every person, regardless of human difference, can access and harness the power of our digital products without bias, harm, or limitation. This one I thought was particularly interesting in the context of banking. And in Canada, for example, there's an issue of what we call internet poverty, where actually when we think about the need to digitally bank, that we actually have a really dispersed and challenging issue that, you know, urban centers have better access to mobile, data, internet, and that other rural areas, including my cottage, where we spend our summer, you can hardly get on the internet because we're not serviced there and the phone service is spotty. So if I needed to send a bill or send my rent, it's more challenging, even 2 hours north of where I live. Now, Salesforce on product inclusion, they said one of the ways we build better, more usable products is through inclusive design. We aspire to drive innovation by including individuals with disabilities through the development process, highlighting voices that are often excluded in the traditional design processes. And I think what's interesting here is that these are all very meaty and that there's actually quite a lot to unpack with digital product equity. So what I decided to do is I did an industry scan. I'm a researcher by nature and by heart. And so when I wanted to move into this field and really learn more about it, I first wanted to look externally as well as internally about what we were doing at Scotiabank, and then externally outside. So I started from this industry scan with the purpose personally to really up-level myself, read white papers, blogs, Medium articles, LinkedIn articles to really sort of understand. I did this on my personal time, what was happening. And then really professionally bring that back as I began to think about how we could approach product equity within my company. So for my approach, this wasn't an all-inclusive thing. I looked at 15 leading tech companies and then 3 research organizations last summer. And what I did is I started in a large Excel and PowerPoint document as I pulled out their vision and mission statements. I looked at their guiding principles. I bookmarked many of the toolkits and frameworks. And then I noted the sort of levels of integration into the organization. And this is something that I'd be happy to talk about later because I think here we talk about the Nielsen Norman Group has a beautiful diagram of UX maturity. And I think that a future leaning process that I would hope that can be created one day is actually having a maturity level or diagram to understand what the integration level of inclusion would be in an organization. So these are the main companies that I looked at, and yeah, so some of them were interesting. Like I met a UNICEF UX designer, and then that inspired some of looking at UNICEF. And otherwise, I sort of focused on the FANG and then others that came about in my research. So what was interesting is that we talk about digital product equity, but there's actually like the naming of these product equity groups or similar are really used synonymously. So I would say product inclusion and product equity are often used synonymously. And so I pulled out a word cloud of words that came out most. And you can see inclusion and inclusive is on there twice. But product equity was really the sort of leaning force. But there were other aspects of accessibility, platform, equity, strategy, design, and this sort of guided me because although we're using different words, the emphasis and intention was very similar. So I'm going to stop for a moment and talk about the sort of business drivers. Like we're all usually working for companies, and there's a level of altruism when we think about equity, but then there's also this idea of inclusion and diversity. So Adobe on product equity says building equitable products isn't simply about altruism, albeit there are endless socioeconomic reasons as to why it's important. It also drives innovation by solving unique people-centric problems, deepening market penetration, and building brand trust by focusing on previously ignored communities. So I started looking at how these different companies were describing product equity, but also like what's the deeper reason behind it. And I'm going to come back to these slides. But what I found about why product equity and inclusion matters, like the key kind of resounding themes were that number one, there's a strategic growth opportunity that, especially in the banking world, we have a lot of competition there's a finite number of Canadian citizens and permanent residents, but by deepening our understanding of our customers, it actually provides a strategic growth opportunity to increase that market share. Secondly, customer belonging. When a product is created intentionally for different customers to improve their acquisition, engagement, and loyalty across the segments, it enhances the retention, and it makes the products feel like they're created for them. This came up in research I did as a UX researcher, but that when customers feel and see themselves in a product, they're often more likely to use it. Thirdly, values alignment is important, and this is why product equity matters as we encounter generational shifts from boomers, Gen X, Gen Z, and now into the millennials and Gen A. There's also like shifts in value alignment, and really understanding that navigating to the customers and different identities is essential. So I'm going to come back to my previous two slides, and something I wanted to bring up is that accessibility can be challenging when one of the challenges, it's not that it's challenging, is that a digital customer experience can be fully accessible, but fully irrelevant to a customer's needs. And so often with accessibility, especially in Canada, there's standards and regulations that exists for the adherence and the adoption. So that would be the sort of WCAG guidelines about what it needs to look and screen reader compatibility. But does the information actually meet the needs of our customers? So in my reading across the industry, I really found that digital product equity, it includes accessibility as sort of table stakes, but what it does differently is it implements activities which actually consider the physical, emotional, and tactile needs of the customer. And so I really feel like the maturity of product inclusion is when it meets our needs of our customers with disabilities and then also addresses how they use the product. For example, something with headers or, the ease of use makes a big difference. So Meta, for example, says designing for global diversity of human needs requires us to understand the behaviors of the people behind them. And we hear from Salesforce, designing for and alongside users with disabilities helps to unleash that innovation. So that digital product equity and inclusion emphasis really steps above the standards regulations for accessibility and says, how do we create a product for this sort of person or that sort of person or this sort of person or individual group? So, all right, I've talked about that. So a common approach, so across those 15 companies that I looked at and 3 research organizations, the 3 things that were common across all of them were the following. Number 1 was adopting this multidimensional view of the user. And I'm going to actually move here to the multidimensional view of the user. Yeah, here we go. So on the screen here, you're going to see an image that I pulled from the Google website. And they actually highlighted that there are different ways, like this is a non-exclusive list of how you might consider identity, but it's actually looking at things that are both seen and unseen. So age is often one, but do we understand a customer's religion or sexual orientation or social economic status, technological proficiency, like where they are geographically? All of these sort of multidimensional things really make a difference in understanding our customers. For example, with my previous financial institution, what we found is that there was a lot of Toronto-centric offers that were happening. Like, for example, in credit card loyalty, maybe an offer would be to have tickets to a concert, but somebody who would be living in a rural area of the country might not have access to, the many theaters and concerts that are available. So does that offer of free concert tickets really meet the needs of somebody who's living far, far away from where those services are offered? So my challenge to you all who are listening now is like, how might we stretch our understanding of our current customers so that we might be inclusive of the many dimensions of their identity? So this Google point is a launch pad. So if we move back to these 3, the second one here is enhancing capabilities through principles and frameworks. So what I thought was wonderful is there are a ton of free resources and frameworks available. And when I think about sort of table stakes for all of us here, one of the beautiful frameworks that I found, this was also from the Google, this was from their 2020 Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion report. And what the researchers found is that across the product design lifecycle, there's actually many inflection points in which inclusion can be added or infused, as I like to say. And the 4 major ones that came up were at that ideation stage, creation, thinking about the product design, the UX research, and then also the testing phases, and then also the marketing phases. So when we think about that, like, I imagine that those who are listening have, everybody has their unique set of product lifecycle inflection points, but at what point might we infuse that inclusion into our product lifecycle? And what the Google researchers found that I really thought was exciting is that inclusion efforts really would increase when inclusion was thought of at one point, but it would be 90% successful when we were getting, 2 stages of these inflection points incorporated intentionally. So I think one of the things that I really took away is that intentional inclusion efforts make a huge difference for product equity efforts. So if we return back to these 3 common approaches that were taken across all, is another was connecting with diversity through community partnerships. So this can look like, I'm going to use this big word of co-creation, but co-creation can happen at a diversity of levels, and it can include diversity on product teams, leaning into the ERGs that are available at your companies for product testing, and also extending your reach of who you're reaching out to and who you're thinking of about your users to community groups who have deeper experiential knowledge. Accessibility groups, they have a guiding principle about like, you want to create with us, not just for us. And I think that that's a really important element when we think about that sort of connecting with diversity through community partnerships. So here again, I pose to you, like, how might we as a group of interested individuals use our community resources to support this more holistic view of our customers. And it doesn't have to be like, I think that the effort involved can be different. Like one way is to include, have a diverse team. And that other way is to then consult internal groups, which could be your ERGs, which are usually an HR process, but instead, could they be used and would these groups be interested in being involved in the research and testing? And then what external groups could the product teams really sort of lean on or understand better? So I'm going to return back to the Microsoft inclusive design. And what they say is we design for all human experiences and needs. So we strive to gather and listen and include as many perspectives as possible with the goal of discovering how to bring out the best in each other and everyone who uses what we create. And I'm thinking now, since I can't see your faces here, but when I'm wondering about this, like, it doesn't have to be the biggest thing, but what are the small sort of measurable things along that product life cycle in those inflection points that we could add inclusion to make sort of small and forward progress toward greater product equity? So I've gone through these slides here. So these are some of the differentiators that I noticed in doing my research that I really was excited about. And I've mentioned some of them before, but I really want to lean in onto that, these 3 aspects. Number 1 was the sort of use of ERGs as internal resources. And so notably, Google and Airbnb highlighted the internal powerhouse of their diverse employees and how they leveraged their ERGs and empowered their internal employees to speak up. I think sometimes ERGs can be, utilized, but like I was part of a women and diversity group, but all I did was ever attend. And so how might I participate? I would have been happy to be involved in research for the company. I think another one that was a differentiator that Instagram, Apple, Airbnb, and Salesforce highlighted was actually tackling responsible AI. This was last summer that I was looking at this research, and I think it's even more important now in the world of Gen AI. But how do we use AI responsibly to reflect the future orientation and kind of this commitment to an equitable world? It's definitely a challenging one as we're sort of, into the world of new frontiers, but how do we make sure that the products are created for every customer? Okay, innovation and future orientation. I thought this one was fascinating because oftentimes futures research is often separated in some ways from accessibility, like I found, and this was my perspective, but that accessibility teams were often felt like we need to follow regulations. But where I was really felt like the digital product equity literature was very hopeful was that it said that innovation really could be, inclusion would be a driving force for innovation. And I'd say more than half of the companies that I looked for really sort of articulated this value. And so these were sort of differentiators that I noticed going forward. So what is available on many of uh, these websites, or these main sort of 15 that I looked at, is number one, guiding principles. So this could be a way longer talk where I could look at the sort of guiding principles, but all of the industry leaders had guiding principles that would encourage them to, and basically a guiding principle is something that can distill and disseminate across your company and be like, yeah, that makes sense to me. I can show you an example. Other ones were toolkits and resources. So notably, I've written some of them there. Microsoft, Google, Adobe, Salesforce, PayPal, Equity Army, and IDRC. They have a ton of information, toolkits that you could use. Salesforce, one was something I really liked, was this idea of a consequence scan. So when you're at that ideation stage or in that product creation stage, can you take a moment where you step back in a workshop, whether it's half an hour or that type of thing, to sort of vision out what could the possible consequences be and almost de-risk the process by thinking about the future ahead of time. There are a ton of educational content resources available. So many of the companies offered content in the form of guidebooks, frameworks, course access, and definitions to support this product equity and inclusion. I can guide you to the Equity Army, has a beautiful infographic that really makes a difference, and case studies. So Microsoft, Google, and Airbnb really kind of showcase those incredible stories of inclusion. So in some ways, I think this can be seen as a PR aspect, but it's also a way I think that we as a design and product community can level each other up by sharing stories of success, because when success is multiplied, you actually can create a really deepened practice. So here are a few, in my last few minutes here, sample of some of the guiding principles across the different companies. So these were my sort of top favorite. Each of the companies had more than one. Usually it was between 3 to 8 guiding principles. So solve for one, extend for many was Microsoft's guiding principle. And it really makes sense that if we're looking at our core users or edge users, if you start with one and you solve a problem, this solution also extends to many. Google says start with equity. Adobe, take the long-term view. Equity Army, diversity is the core of innovation. So I'm going back again, that guiding principles, the goal is to inspire and to disseminate this knowledge. Oh, sorry, that first A was Alphabet. The second A here is Adobe, targeted universalism. So that's, again, how do we think about our customers in a way that's targeted, but also universal to their needs. Meta took a people-first approach. Apple says inclusivity at every step. I was really inspired. I think on the maturity level, Apple would be high for their inclusion effort, because really they're taking inclusivity at every step of those different inclusion points. Airbnb here, I think, is an interesting one, constantly improving. This is a really an important one that we step back on. Airbnb had some like a wonderful case study. It was called Project Lighthouse. And I can guide you to that in that you go airbnb.com/against discrimination. And what was really interesting is that they found in their research that users of Airbnb were being discriminated against. And they actually took a step to really constantly improve by really trying to wipe out discrimination. Uber says prioritize impact over your intentions. And Salesforce says prevent harms and misuse. So again, going back to that idea of the consequence scanning. So I've talked about some of these tools and resources, taking that broader view of your customer and fusing inclusion across the product lifecycle, empowering your ERGs through integration, creating roadmaps to empower and co-create with different community groups. Some of that Google offers that there's this, you can Google the case for product inclusion and looking at, there's different educational content available. And finally, some of these project like case studies that are available, like the Project Lighthouse that I spoke to you about in terms of Airbnb and the Google Assistant. So I'm just going to take a moment and wrap us onto my final slide here.
Thank you,
so
Christina.
in terms of next steps here, Yanis, you can see my next steps for building the practice.
Yep.
Okay, so my final definition for that I think is easier to take away for product equity is that product equity is an extension to the inclusive design. It's that next step that involves intentional measures to formalize and embed inclusion. And this is accomplished through a variety of areas. But number one is encouraging and covering areas of exclusion, developing shared principles as a company, frameworks, and organizational goals, and then partnering with those diverse partners to co-create solutions. So just to sum up, Annie Jean-Baptiste, she's really spearheaded, and she's written a book here called Building for Everyone, but she says product inclusion is about bringing that human and the business case together to create products and services that truly serve your customers. So my challenge to all of you is consider your user base. How can you strengthen your exclusion awareness and seek out those edge cases? Solve for one and extend for many. How can you refine your practices? Yeah. Where can you implement inclusion? Okay, I'm done. And practice co-creation.
It's all good. We made it right on time. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us, all these slides, all the material. I'll take the time required to type it all up, perhaps with some help from you. I think we have time here at the last minute. Any questions, comments, reactions? Perhaps I can pull it back to you, Chris, who was here also in the morning or at the beginning.
I have a question.
Sure.
Sure. Why don't you go?
Hi. Unfortunately I didn't see the first 5 minutes, but maybe you've mentioned this, but I also work a lot with inclusion, and I wanted to ask whether in your research neurodiversity was also touched upon within like disabilities or the inclusive design process, whether neurodivergence or neurodivergent users are included within the disability scales, or whether they were included differently or not at all, maybe.
Oh yeah,
All
definitely included for sure. That's a great question.
Very good. And Chris, were you about to say something now that we got like a yes and no question?
No, I was just saying, I was going to say that that's very interesting. I'm just starting to understand the product here, and we've been talking a lot about accessibility, which is very important, and our current product has no accessibility at all. But it's also interesting to like broaden that up and think about being more inclusive. So yeah, it was really inspiring to hear everything.
Great. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I really appreciate it. That's